The autumn sun bathed the streets of Lyon with a soft golden light as Sylvie walked the familiar path to the Moreau mansion. Her footsteps echoed on the old cobblestones, blending with the hum of the waking city. At 35, Sylvie carried not only the weight of her responsibilities but also the hopes of a better life. Arriving at the imposing residence, Sylvie took a deep breath, adjusting the impeccably white apron over her black dress. Today would be an important day. Mr. Moreau, an influential businessman, was hosting a business lunch that could change the course of his company. "Good morning, Sylvie," greeted Marie, the cook, as the maid entered through the back door. "Ready for today's circus?" Sylvie smiled, trying to hide her nervousness. "As always, Marie. Let's show them how it's done." The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Sylvie rushed back and forth, polishing silverware, setting the dining table with the finest china, and ensuring every detail was perfect. The sound of raised voices announced the guests' arrival, and Sylvie felt her heart race. "Sylvie!" Mrs. Moreau's shrill voice echoed through the house. "Bring the tea to the living room. And don't be late." With trembling hands, Sylvie prepared the tea tray. The delicate porcelain tinkled softly as she made her way to the living room. The businessmen's voices mingled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed tea. Entering the room, Sylvie felt all eyes turn to her. Mr. Moreau, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes, gestured impatiently for her to hurry. It was then that disaster struck. Maybe it was the subtly wrinkled Persian rug or perhaps the nerves making her hands shake. In an instant, Sylvie felt her foot stumble, and the world seemed to slow down. The tray tilted, and before she could react, the scalding tea spilled directly onto Mr. Moreau's lap. Mr. Moreau's scream of pain and surprise was deafening. He stood up abruptly, knocking the cup to the floor, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. "You incompetent fool," he shouted, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Look what you've done." Sylvie froze, her eyes wide with horror. I'm sorry, sir. It was an accident, Silence. Mrs. Moreau intervened, her voice as sharp as a blade. "How dare you ruin this crucial moment for my husband? Do you have any idea how important this meeting is?" The guests watched in awkward silence, some barely hiding smiles of disdain. Sylvie felt tears burn her eyes but refused to let them fall. Mr. Moreau, still writhing in pain, pointed an accusatory finger at Sylvie. "You're fired. Do you understand? Fired." "No, please," Sylvie pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "I need this job. I have bills to pay, my mother is sick." Mrs. Moreau laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "Oh, dear. Do you really think we care about your personal problems? After this display of incompetence, you'll be lucky to get a job cleaning public restrooms." "Exactly," Mr. Moreau agreed, furiously wiping his trousers with a napkin. "And don't think you'll leave here with good references. I'll make sure all my contacts know about your ineptitude. You'll never work in a respectable house in Lyon again." The words hit Sylvie like physical blows. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, the world spinning around her. Years of hard work, of sacrifices, all ruined by a moment of carelessness. "Now get out of my sight," Mr. Moreau shouted. "And take your belongings with you. I don't want to see your face here again." With shaky legs, Sylvie left the room, the looks of pity and disdain from the guests burning into her back. As she walked through the corridors she knew so well, each step seemed to take her away not only from that house but from the entire future she had imagined for herself. In the kitchen, Marie was waiting for her, eyes full of compassion. "Oh, Sylvie." But Sylvie couldn't bear the pity at that moment. Without a word, she gathered her things and left through the back door, just as she had entered so many times before. The autumn sun, which had seemed so welcoming before, now mocked her misfortune. As she walked the streets of Lyon, Sylvie wondered how her life had changed so drastically in a matter of minutes. The cruel words of the Moreaus echoed in her mind, painting a bleak and uncertain future. With each step that took her away from the mansion, Sylvie felt the weight of her humiliation and the uncertainty of tomorrow pressing on her shoulders. Dawn brought a new day to Lion, but for Sylvie, it seemed the sun had lost its shine. Despite the humiliation of the previous day, she found herself returning to the Moreau mansion. Not by choice, but out of necessity, she needed to collect her last belongings and perhaps beg for one last chance. With a heavy heart, Sylvie entered through the back door, finding the kitchen eerily silent. Marie, the cook, gave her a sympathetic look but said nothing. The air was thick with tension. "Sylvie," Mrs. Moreau's voice sounded cold and distant, "since you're here, finish tidying up the office before you leave. Consider it your last duty in this house." Swallowing her pride, Sylvie nodded silently. She made her way to Mr. Moreau's office, a room that had always intimidated her with its grandeur. Leather-bound books lined the walls, and the scent of fine tobacco lingered in the air. As she dusted the shelves, her thoughts wandered. How would she explain to her sick mother that she had lost her job? How would she pay the rent this month? Each unanswered question weighed on her shoulders, making the simple act of cleaning seem like a Herculean task. Then something caught her eye. Moving a heavy bookcase to clean behind it, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Curious, Sylvie bent down to pick it up. It was a lottery ticket. For a moment, Sylvie was frozen, holding the ticket as if it were something precious and, at the same time, dangerous. Her eyes scanned the printed numbers, a sequence that could mean nothing or everything. "I must return it immediately," she thought, conscience weighing on her. But then the cruel voices from the day before echoed in her mind. The threats, the humiliation. With trembling hands, Sylvie folded the ticket and put it in the pocket of her apron. "I'll return it later," she told herself, trying to justify her action. Not now. The rest of the cleaning passed in a blur. Sylvie moved mechanically, her body performing familiar tasks while her mind was elsewhere. The weight of the ticket in her pocket seemed to increase with every minute. When she finally finished, Sylvie made her way to the front door, carrying a small box with her belongings. Mrs. Moreau was waiting for her, her gaze cold and calculating. "I hope you've learned a valuable lesson, Sylvie," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Incompetence comes at a high price." Sylvie wanted to respond, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she just nodded, murmuring a barely audible goodbye before leaving. The streets of Lyon seemed different now. More hostile, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the weight of guilt and uncertainty making each step harder. Sylvie walked aimlessly, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Arriving at her small apartment, Sylvie placed the box on the table and collapsed into a chair. Only then did she remember the ticket. With trembling fingers, she took it out of her pocket, looking at the numbers as if they could give her some answer. "What have I done?" she murmured to herself, the reality of her actions finally setting in. She had taken something that didn't belong to her, driven by the stress and resentment of the moment. Sylvie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decision. Should she go back and return the ticket? But how would she explain? They would accuse her of theft. The consequences seemed terrible, no matter what she did. The sound of a distant siren brought her back to reality. Sylvie looked at the clock and realized hours had passed. Exhaustion hit her like a wave, and she decided to deal with everything in the morning. Storing the ticket in a drawer, Sylvie prepared for sleep, her body exhausted but her mind still agitated. As she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the ticket and what it might mean. Was it just a worthless piece of paper, or could it be the key to a new life? With these turbulent thoughts, Sylvie fell into a restless sleep, unaware that that small ticket was about to change the course of her life forever. Sylvie's sleep was interrupted by the blaring sound of the neighbor's television. Irritated, she got up to close the window, but a phrase caught her attention, and the winning numbers for the €10 million jackpot are. Sylvie froze, her heart racing. Slowly, as if moved by a force beyond her control, she went to the drawer where she had stored the ticket. With trembling hands, she took out the paper and compared it with the numbers announced on TV. One by one, the numbers matched. "It can't be," Sylvie whispered, her world spinning. She checked once, twice, 3 times. There was no doubt, the ticket in her hands was worth 10 million euros. For a moment, a wave of euphoria swept over her. All her financial problems could disappear in the blink of an eye. Her mother could receive the best medical treatment, she could buy a house, travel the world. But then, the harsh reality hit her. The ticket was not hers. She had taken it from the Moreau's house, even with the intention of returning it. If she claimed the prize, she would be accused of theft. Her life, already complicated, would become a legal nightmare. Sylvie sat on the edge of the bed, the ticket clutched in her hands, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. Returning the ticket meant giving up a fortune that could change her life. But keeping it, that would make her a criminal. The hours passed, and Sylvie remained awake, wrestling internally. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through her window, she had made a decision: she would not mention the ticket, at least for now. She needed time to think, to consider all her options. With renewed determination, Sylvie prepared for another day of job hunting. Despite the fortune that might be within her reach, she knew she couldn't count on it. She had to act as if nothing had changed. In the streets of Lyon, Sylvie went from establishment to establishment, handing out resumes and asking about openings. The day passed in a blur of closed doors and pitying looks. In the afternoon, exhausted and discouraged, she stopped at a café to rest. "Café au lait, please," she ordered, counting the coins in her purse. As she waited, Sylvie couldn't help but overhear the animated conversation at the next table. "Did you hear? The winning ticket was sold here in Lyon. Imagine that, 10 million euros. Who could be the lucky one?" Sylvie felt her stomach churn. The waiter brought her coffee, and she sipped it slowly, trying to calm her nerves. Back at her apartment, Sylvie found a late rent notice on the door. The reality of her situation hit her again. With the ticket, she could solve all these problems in an instant. But at what cost? That night, lying in her bed, Sylvie thought of all her options. Could she try to claim the prize anonymously? Or maybe donate part of the money to the Moreaus as compensation? Each idea seemed riskier than the last. One thing was clear: she couldn't just show up with the ticket and hand it over to the Moreaus. They would accuse her of theft, without a doubt. And even if they believed her, after the humiliation she suffered, the idea of handing them a fortune was almost unbearable. The following days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Sylvie continued her job search, did her household chores, and cared for her mother. But every moment, the weight of the secret consumed her. A week after the discovery, Sylvie finally landed a new job as a waitress at a local restaurant. It was hard work, with long hours and low pay, but it was something. As she served tables and smiled at customers, Sylvie couldn't help but think of the irony of her situation: a multimillionaire in secret, but living as if she were on the brink of poverty. At night, alone in her apartment, Sylvie would take the ticket from its hiding place and examine it. That little piece of paper represented so much: hope, fear, guilt, endless possibilities. It was a test of her character, a moral dilemma that consumed her. As the days turned into weeks, Sylvie continued her double life: a dedicated worker by day, a reluctant keeper of a millionaire's secret by night. With each passing day, the decision to keep the ticket a secret weighed more heavily on her conscience. But with each day, the idea of giving up that fortune became more difficult. Sylvie knew she would eventually have to make a definitive decision. But for now, she continued her life, trapped between two worlds, waiting for the moment when fate would force her hand. The sun had barely risen when Sylvie's phone rang, pulling her from restless sleep. The voice on the other end of the line was Marie, the Moreau's cook. "Sylvie, you need to come here immediately. Mr. Moreau is in a frenzy looking for something. He wants to question everyone who worked here last week." Sylvie's heart raced. "But I don't work there anymore, Marie. Why does he want me?" "He insists. He says it's about something very valuable that has gone missing. Please, come quickly." With trembling hands, Sylvie dressed and hurried out. All the way to the Moreau mansion, her mind raced. He could only be looking for the ticket. The ticket she had kept, worth a fortune. Arriving, Sylvie found the house in complete chaos. Furniture out of place, drawers open, papers scattered. In the center of the living room, Mr. Moreau looked like a possessed man, his wild eyes scanning every corner. "Ah, Sylvie, finally," he exclaimed upon seeing her. "Where is it? Where did you put it?" Sylvie felt her blood run cold. "What are you talking about, Mr. Moreau?" "Don't play dumb," he shouted, approaching menacingly. "The lottery ticket. I kept it in the office, and now it's gone." Mrs. Moreau appeared, her face a mask of concern. "Dear, I'm sure Sylvie doesn't know anything. Let's calm down and think rationally." But Mr. Moreau wasn't listening. He began questioning Sylvie fiercely, asking about her last day of work, what she had done in the office, and whether she had seen anything out of place. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sylvie denied everything. "I just cleaned the office as usual, Mr. Moreau. I didn't see any ticket." With every denial, Mr. Moreau became more agitated. He began searching the drawers again, muttering to himself. "It has to be here. It has to be. 10 million euros. It can't just disappear." Sylvie watched, a mix of fear and guilt consuming her. She wanted to confess, to hand over the ticket and end this torment. But fear of the consequences paralyzed her. The questioning went on for hours. Mr. Moreau questioned every employee, from the gardener to the driver. The tension in the house was palpable, with everyone casting suspicious glances at one another. "Someone here is lying," Mr. Moreau shouted, his voice echoing through the mansion. "And I will find out who it is." Mrs. Moreau tried to calm him down, but it was useless. She turned to Sylvie, her eyes pleading. "Sylvie, please, if you saw something, anything, tell us. This ticket is very important to us." For a moment, Sylvie almost wavered. But then she remembered the humiliation she suffered, the threats to ruin her reputation. With supreme effort, she kept her expression neutral. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moreau. I really don't know anything." The hours dragged on. Mr. Moreau alternated between moments of fury and despair. He threatened to call the police, accuse everyone of theft, and destroy careers. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Sylvie was released to leave. As she left the mansion, she could still hear Mr. Moreau's shouts echoing. At home, Sylvie collapsed into her bed, the emotions of the day finally overwhelming her. She cried, feeling the weight of her secret more than ever. The ticket, hidden in a secret place in her apartment, seemed to burn in her conscience. She knew the situation would only get worse. Mr. Moreau wouldn't give up easily. That night, while the city of lions slept, Sylvie remained awake, tormented by her decision. The money that could change her life now seemed more like a curse than a blessing. The tension in the Moreau house had spread, ensnaring her in its web. And Sylvie knew that sooner or later, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The morning after the interrogation at the Moreau mansion, Sylvie woke with renewed determination. She couldn't continue living in this limbo of fear and guilt. She needed professional guidance. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and dialed a law office. "I'd like to schedule an anonymous consultation," she said, her voice low as if afraid of being overheard. Hours later, Sylvie found herself in a small office in downtown Lyon. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named Pierre Dupont, observed her with curiosity. So, mademoiselle, how can I help you? Sylvie took a deep breath. It's a hypothetical situation, she began, avoiding the lawyer's gaze. If someone found a winning lottery ticket that didn't belong to them, what would be the legal implications? Mr. Dupont leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. Well, that depends on several circumstances. How was this ticket found? Sylvie chose her words carefully. Let's say it was found at that person's workplace, fallen behind a piece of furniture. The lawyer nodded slowly. In that case, legally, the ticket still belongs to the original owner. If the person who found it tries to claim the prize, they could be accused of misappropriation or even theft. Sylvie's heart sank. Her suspicions were confirmed. However, Mr. Dupont continued, there are nuances. If the ticket was genuinely lost and the original owner can't prove they purchased it, there are legal precedents that might allow the finder to claim the prize. A spark of hope ignited in Sylvie. And if the finder initially intended to return the ticket but later discovered it was a winner? That would complicate things, the lawyer admitted. The original intention to return could be viewed favorably by a judge, but the fact that it wasn't returned immediately after discovering its value would be problematic. Sylvie absorbed the information, her stomach churning. What would be your recommendation in this hypothetical situation? Mr. Dupont studied her for a moment. Honestly, the safest thing would be to return the ticket anonymously. But if the person decided to try claiming the prize, they would need immediate legal representation and be prepared for a legal battle. Thanking the lawyer, Sylvie left the office with more questions than answers. The possibility of legally claiming the prize existed, but the risks were enormous. Meanwhile, at the Moreau mansion, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Mr. Moreau, convinced that the ticket had been stolen, hired a private investigator. I want you to investigate every employee, he instructed the detective. Dig into their lives, their spending, anything suspicious. Someone here knows where my ticket is, and I'll find out who. Mrs. Moreau watched with growing concern. Dear, don't you think you're going too far? What if the ticket simply got lost? 10 million euros don't just get lost, Amelie. Mr. Moreau exploded. Someone took it, and when I find out who it was, that person will wish they were never born. The news of the investigation spread quickly among the current and former employees of the Moreaus. Sylvie received an anxious call from Marie. Sylvie, it's terrible. They're interrogating everyone again, digging into our lives. Mr. Moreau even threatened to sue anyone he suspects is lying. Panic gripped Sylvie. She knew it was only a matter of time before the investigator reached her. Her recent savings, though modest, might raise suspicion. That night, alone in her apartment, Sylvie stared at the lottery ticket. That little piece of paper, which once represented hope, now seemed like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. She faced an impossible decision: risk everything for a chance at fortune or return the ticket and go back to her life of financial hardship. Whatever choice she made, Sylvie knew her life would never be the same. With tears in her eyes, she picked up a pen and paper. It was time to weigh her pros and cons, to make a decision that would change the course of her life forever. The night was long for Sylvie. After hours of agonizing reflection, she finally made a decision: she would return the ticket anonymously. Peace of mind was worth more than any fortune. The next morning, Sylvie prepared a simple envelope with no return address. With trembling hands, she placed the ticket inside, sealed the envelope, and put it in her purse. Her plan was to drop it in the Moreau's mailbox at night when no one could see her. But fate had other plans. As she left her home, Sylvie encountered a man in a suit standing in front of her building. His sharp eyes examined her from head to toe. "Miss Sylvie Dubois?" he asked, his voice firm and authoritative. Sylvie's heart raced. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" "I'm Jacques Lenoir, a private investigator hired by Mr. Moreau," he replied, showing a card. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your former employment. Sylvie felt her legs give way. It was as if her worst nightmare was materializing before her eyes. I'm late for work, she stammered, trying to walk past him. Lenore gently blocked her path. This won't take long, miss. May we speak in your apartment? Realizing she had no choice, Sylvie led him back to her small apartment. The envelope with the ticket felt like it was burning in her purse. Once inside, Lenore began his questioning. His questions were meticulous, focused on her last day at the Moreau mansion. Sylvie answered as best she could, her stomach churning with every lie. Miss Dubois, Lenore finally said, his eyes fixed on her, I've noticed that you've recently made some deposits into your bank account. Small, but regular. Where did this money come from? Sylvie paled. I've been doing some freelance cleaning jobs, she lied, her voice betraying her nervousness. Lenore leaned forward. You know, it's curious. I examined your finances over the past few months. These deposits started exactly after you left the Moreau mansion. The silence that followed was deafening. Sylvie could hear her own heart pounding frantically. She knew she was cornered. With a deep sigh, Sylvie reached into her purse. Mr. Lenore, I have something to show you. With trembling hands, she took out the envelope and handed it to the investigator. Lenore opened it carefully, his eyes widening as he saw the contents. My God, he whispered. It's the ticket. Tears began to roll down Sylvie's face as she recounted the entire story, how she found the ticket, her initial intention to return it, the discovery of the prize, and the torment she had lived through since then. I was going to return it today, she concluded, sobbing. I swear I never meant to keep it. I was just afraid. Lenore watched her for a long moment, his face a mixture of surprise and admiration. Miss Dubois, he finally said, do you understand that you could have claimed this prize? Millions of euros, and you chose to return it. Sylvie nodded sadly. I know. But I couldn't live with that guilt. It wasn't mine to keep. Lenore stood, the ticket secure in his hand. We need to go to the Moreau mansion immediately. Mr. Moreau needs to hear this from you. The journey to the mansion was the longest of Sylvie's life. When they arrived, they were greeted by an agitated Mr. Moreau and an anxious Mrs. Moreau. Seeing the ticket in Lenore's hands, Mr. Moreau let out a cry of joy. But his expression quickly turned to fury upon seeing Sylvie. You, he roared. You stole my ticket. Please, sir, Lenore intervened. Hear the full story before you judge. In the following minutes, Sylvie, through tears, recounted everything once more. Mr. Moreau listened, his face cycling through a range of emotions, anger, disbelief, and finally, reluctant understanding. When Sylvie finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Mr. Moreau looked at the ticket in his hands, then at Sylvie. You could have kept all of this, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. But you chose to return it. Sylvie nodded, unable to speak. Mr. Moreau exchanged a glance with his wife, then turned to Sylvie. What you did was wrong, he said firmly. But your final honesty, well, that counts for something. In that moment, Sylvie knew her life was about to change once again. But this time, it would be because of her own choices, not by a stroke of luck or misfortune. The silence in the Moreau mansion's living room was palpable. Sylvie, with her eyes downcast, awaited her fate, while Mr. and Mrs. Moreau exchanged significant glances. Investigator Lenore stood in a corner, watching the scene with interest. Finally, Mr. Moreau cleared his throat. Sylvie, he began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, what you did was wrong. Taking something that doesn't belong to you, even with the initial intention of returning it, was a serious mistake. Sylvie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know, sir. And I'm sorry, I truly am. Mr. Moreau continued, however, your final decision to return the ticket, even in the face of the possibility of millions, demonstrates a character, well, I underestimated. Mrs. Moreau stepped forward. What my husband is trying to say, Sylvie, is that we're willing to give you a second chance. Sylvie looked up, barely daring to believe what she was hearing. We won't press charges, Mr. Moreau declared. And more than that, I'd like to offer you your job back, if you're interested. A sob of relief escaped Sylvie's lips. I don't know what to say. Thank you so much. Mr. Moreau raised a hand. There's more. Considering you could have kept the entire prize but chose honesty, I believe you deserve a reward. He turned to his wife, who nodded in approval. We'll offer you 5% of the prize as a reward for your honesty. That will give you 500,000 euros. Sylvie's eyes widened in shock. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of having. Sir, I can't accept, it's too much, she stammered. Mrs. Moreau smiled kindly. You can and should accept it, Sylvie. Use it wisely. In the days that followed, Sylvie's life changed dramatically. With the reward, she was finally able to provide her mother with the much-needed medical treatment. She rented a better apartment closer to work and even made a small donation to a local charity. Returning to work at the Moreau mansion, Sylvie found a transformed environment. Mr. Moreau, though still demanding, treated her with newfound respect. Mrs. Moreau frequently asked for her opinion on domestic matters, valuing her perspective. One afternoon, while Sylvie was organizing the library, Mr. Moreau entered the room. Sylvie, he said, I'd like to thank you again for your honesty. You know, losing that ticket made me realize how obsessed I was with money and status. Seeing someone give up a fortune for principles, well, it made me rethink many things. Sylvie smiled shyly. Thank you, sir. I learned a lot from this experience too. Good, he replied. Because I'm thinking of expanding our business, and I'd like you to take on a more significant role in managing the house. What do you think? The offer took Sylvie by surprise, but she felt a wave of gratitude and determination. It would be an honor, Mr. Moreau. I promise I won't let you down. That night, returning home, Sylvie reflected on the incredible journey she had experienced. From a struggling maid, she had almost become a millionaire through dishonest means, only to find a better path through integrity. Sitting at the table in her new dining room, Sylvie wrote in her diary, I've learned that honesty, even when difficult, is always worth it in the end. The temptation can be strong, but the burden of carrying a secret is much greater. Today, I'm grateful not only for the second chance and the financial reward but for the life lesson I received. The true value is not in the money we have but in the character we build and the choices we make. Closing the diary, Sylvie looked out the window at the lights of Lyon. Her future, once so uncertain, now shone with possibilities. She knew she would face more challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them, with honesty, courage, and the hard-earned wisdom of her experiences.